I got to know my grandfather more and more over the years. He and I had a very late dinner at his little house in the country one night, and afterwards we went on his back porch and he smoked his pipe and we just talked. And I happened to ask him if he had any regrets in life, and I expected him to talk about having never remarried or never opening his own clinic. He'd been a doctor all his life. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment and then said that to that very day he held one very shameful secret inside, and he finally felt safe enough to reveal it. He used that word specifically, safe. He said he regretted never telling the police that he was almost certain of the identity of a killer. So, needless to say, I begged him to tell me the story, and with a lot of hesitation he did. It was the year 1951, and my grandfather, whose name is John, was working at a rehabilitation center in Cumberland, Maryland. John woke up in bed one night in January, and he felt his heart pounding, and he had a bizarre feeling of being very cold inside his skin, not on its surface, inside it. He was alarmed. He got up and he started pacing back and forth across his bedroom, trying to understand this feeling. It was like a panic attack, but with more unusual symptoms. Before it fully subsided, he happened to look out his window at his front yard and the little road beyond it. There was someone standing out there at the curb. It was a little before 2 in the morning, and it had begun to snow very lightly. John put on his robe and his shoes, and he opened his front door. The woman out there, it was a woman. She didn't move. She was holding one arm up at her side in a strange way. John called out, but she didn't answer. And he moved closer to her, and as he did so, he heard a small sound, and he realized that the woman was wearing little finger bells on her left hand, and she was clanging them softly as she stood there in the snow. She wore tattered shoes and a ragged brown dress. She looked very young, in her 20s, and had a plain face and unstylish hair. John asked her if he could help her, but she only looked at him and clanged her little bells. She wasn't shivering at all, which was odd. She seemed to want to be where she was, but he told her to follow him inside so he could call someone to come get her. And she followed him willingly enough, as she spoke very soft words under her breath, not mumbling, but whispering. My grandfather remembered that his bizarre symptoms had disappeared quickly as soon as he ventured out into the night. He asked this woman some questions, but she didn't answer any of them except one. When he asked her if she needed something to eat, she said, "I swallowed a farmer's eye in Lancaster." And then she opened her mouth wide, as if to show him. Her mouth was empty, and she closed again and smiled, a strange smile. She clanged her finger bells and followed John to the guest room. His plan, if he couldn't get any information out of her, was to just keep her safe and dry and call a friend at County Hospital to drive over in an ambulance as soon as dawn came. He didn't own a car himself, and he never has since. She sat on the bed, and she told him that she would try to go to sleep, but that sometimes, quote, they shook her head about. There was no indication of who they were. John asked her once more if there was someone he could call. To this, she responded that she was not even close to being who he thought she was. She said, "You make me laugh." And then she threw her head back and did just that. And that laugh was what first made my grandfather scared to be in the house with her. The voice that came out of her throat was first her own, but then suddenly it seemed to belong to a small child, and then after that a different woman entirely. He compared it to an audio montage made by a sound editor. He stared at her, waiting for her to say something more, but she closed her eyes and lay down on the bed and sounded her bells again. He went back upstairs, but he couldn't go to sleep after that. After his strange physical malady and having this stranger on the floor below him, it wasn't going to happen. He sat in a chair and he smoked and he watched the snowfall outside, and he was wondering what would happen if it accumulated so much that the ambulance couldn't come. 2 hours passed, and his eyes were getting heavier and heavier when he heard the shaking of those finger bells again. Far away, but it didn't sound like they were coming from the guest room. They seemed closer. The sound came just once. John got up and he opened the bedroom door very slowly and he went out into the hall. He thought the sound had come from as close as the staircase. But the woman wasn't there. He stood in that same spot for a full half hour, waiting. He went down the stairs as soon as the sky began to lighten. He called the hospital from the kitchen, and the ambulance was promised in about 30 minutes. It would have been 10, but the snow was really falling now. The wind was picking up, so John waited nervously out on the back porch, closing the door behind him. He didn't even want to check on the woman. When the ambulance arrived, he proceeded very carefully up the drive. John went out and he told the driver, whose name was Patrick Edliston, that they didn't need a gurney. The woman could walk under her own power and she just needed an evaluation. So the two men went into the house and John knocked on the guest room door. And when there was no answer, he opened it. The woman was gone. They both checked the whole house, though there was nowhere for her to have gone. Edliston trotted back to the ambulance to call back in. John went through the kitchen and stepped out onto the back lawn, which was under 4 inches of snow now. He immediately saw footprints leading across the yard toward the woods. He began to follow the footprints, moving as fast as he could, though the wind and the snow in his face and the slippery footing made it difficult. Once or twice as he went, he had to just stop to lower his head and peer closer at the ground, because the darkness wasn't retreating very quickly. He spotted the stranger a few hundred yards into the woods. She was near the bank of a small stream. As soon as John saw her moving away from him, he shouted, and she stopped and turned. And she waited for him to approach. She smiled and took a step towards him. John remembered that the wind had blown her hair into her mouth, and it had caught there, so it appeared almost as if she were eating it. He had to lean in to hear what she was saying to him. All it was a single sentence. "I'll make you remember me and all I can do," is what she said. And she suddenly raised her left arm and swung it toward him in a swooping arc. He felt her hand connect with his right cheek hard, and then, unfathomably, he swore, as an old man, that he had felt her fingers puncture his cheek entirely, tearing right through the flesh, and he could feel her fingertips touch his teeth, and those cold little bells digging against his face and the open wound. For 1 second of mortal shock and panic, he stood there as she laughed and pushed her fingers deeper through his cheek, seeming to feel for his tongue. He flinched back instinctively, and her hand withdrew, and he felt his cheek become whole again in an instant. There was no blood, there was no anything. It had never really happened. The woman turned and she began to run through the snow, and this time John didn't follow her. He sank to his knees in a panic, feeling his face. There was nothing wrong with it. The woman disappeared into the mist, and a minute later Edliston was behind him, helping him to his feet. There was a real police search for the woman then, but it didn't amount to much, because 16 inches of snow fell that day, and the area was stifled. She'd vanished. That began the time when my grandfather would see her in his dreams. These were the worst nightmares he'd ever had, but eventually they did begin to fade. And one morning, almost a year after his encounter with the woman, he woke up inexplicably cold, and he almost went into a state of panic before he realized that he wasn't cold because of some premonition that she had returned, but because he'd left a window open. He couldn't forget that feeling of having been freezing inside his skin, as if his organs had suddenly been coated in ice. More than once his dreams took the form of reliving his first hour with that woman. But in the dream, when she said she'd eaten the eye of a farmer in Lancaster and opened her mouth to show him, he woke up stifling a scream, because now she truly had. There were other waking moments when my grandfather was haunted. Once he was on a train to Manhattan to visit his brother, and the train had to stop in New Jersey with an engine problem a little after dark. It was sitting on the tracks in the middle of a small town, and he looked out the window, and he saw a woman sitting on a bench under a street light, about 100 yards away. He couldn't make out her face, but for some reason he was immediately convinced that it was her. She never moved until the train pulled away again 10 minutes later. 7 years after the night of that snowstorm in Cumberland, John was contacted by the Ohio State Police about a murder case that was being investigated in Youngstown. By that time he was considered an expert in abnormal psychology, and he was occasionally called upon to testify in court as such. And now a detective who knew of his work wanted to send him a stack of paperwork that amounted to the evidence collected so far in the killing of Father Owner Corvett, a 40-year-old Catholic priest. Half the evidence consisted of photographs of the crime scene. Now, because the material was too sensitive to send through the mail, the detective asked John if he could drive out and meet him at a hotel, which was near the western Maryland border, where John was at a convention of clinicians. He agreed, and the detective gave him the materials, and over coffee he told him more about the case. So John went back to his hotel room, and in the small hours of the night, the first thing he did was read Father Corvett's diary, which hadn't been kept routinely but did contain a few references to a homeless woman who'd arrived in Youngstown about 7 weeks before the murder. Father Corvett described her only as a docile, mostly mute woman who he'd been trying to help. For some reason he never referred to her by name. In the diary he only called her the Snake Lady. The police never had found out why. Nor did the priest ever make direct mention of the time he began to spend in university libraries and theological and seminary libraries all around the area and well beyond it. These habits had to be verified through looking at his materials checkout records, which confirmed that he had begun to research something that was taking him further and further away from Youngstown, in his necessity to find books that were more and more obscure. Whatever it was he was trying to learn about first touched upon schizophrenia and drug abuse, but then toward the end he seemed to be reading mainly about ancient religious beliefs centered around the Middle East. It was impossible to really tell what he was focused on, though he had requested at one point a photocopy of 2 essays on the obscure belief among some Babylonian tribes that the souls of the dead could congregate inside a single body to resurrect it. There just wasn't that much to go on in the diary. So John read that, and then he started going through the stack of crime scene photos. The scene was the church where Father Corvett conducted his services. In the wide shot of the interior, which was taken from the back of the church, it seemed totally empty, unless you looked hard, and you could see that all the way in the first row of pews, a solitary man was sitting, facing forward. The other photos showed that this was the priest. This was Father Corvett. He'd been killed with 2 knife wounds to the heart. He was just slightly slumped over, as if he'd been sitting on the pew, turned partially sideways, perhaps speaking to someone who'd been sitting beside him. He'd simply never fallen over. My grandfather said there were more than 150 photographs of him in this position. As he looked more closely at the little details of each one, he saw writing on the seat of the pew, about 24 inches away, small writing that had been done in pencil, almost looking like a child had been bored. The police knew about the writing, and they just didn't know where it had come from. But the style of those letters, which spelled out completely nonsensical, unconnected words, made my grandfather set the photos aside and light his pipe to calm himself. He called the detective, Harold Brown, to see if maybe he hadn't yet left the area, and he hadn't. So my grandfather left the hotel in order to walk the 12 blocks to the police station where Brown was meeting with a colleague. He needed to talk to him in person because he recognized the letters the killer had printed on that pew from some faint writing that his night visitor had made on the windowsill of his guest room. She'd taken a pen off a table and done it, making just 3 or 4 words out of nothing, and putting odd-looking accents over the H's and the V's. So it was about 12 blocks across downtown Grantsville to the station. The streets were very quiet. John was walking across the little town square when everything around him started to lose its color all at once. The color was bleeding out of every tree and every street sign and car parked against the curb, and he began to feel sick to his stomach. He started to cough, and then he lapsed into a dry, heavy retch, and he made his way to the closest bench, and he sat down, and he put his head between his knees. A profound sense of dread came over him. He sensed that something truly awful was about to happen to him, and he had just raised his head to look up and around to see if maybe there was someone else on the street or a public place he could run to feel safe, when suddenly his head was flung back, then forward again, as if an unseen and unfelt hand had grabbed it. Forward and back until his neck was almost snapping, his head whipping up and down. He tried to shout, but he couldn't. He had lost all control of his body, which was almost flying off the park bench with the force of this bizarre seizure. It lasted only about 5 seconds, and then he fell off the bench and onto the grass, dizzy and in great pain. After a minute, he stood up, trying to regain his balance. And he told me that somehow he knew that as long as he didn't take another single step toward the police station, he would be all right. He turned and began to stagger back in the other direction, back where he came from. And with every step he took, more color came back into the world around him, and the pain in his neck subsided. And he was back in the lobby of his hotel in just a couple of minutes. He told the clerk that if anyone called to be put through to his room, he should tell them he had taken ill. He made his way up to his room, collapsed on his bed, and he remembered weeping, knowing that he could never tell anyone about the woman, ever. He would send back the crime scene evidence without a note. By intending to speak of that woman and perhaps sending the police after her, he felt he had enraged something that was in control of her. He vowed at that moment never to speak of her to anyone for any reason, in the hope that he would be left alone. That night was the longest of his life. He waited to feel that invisible hand return to maybe choke him, strike him, kill him. He went to church for the first time in his life 2 weeks later, and he fully embraced Catholicism that summer. He never stopped. That's where his story of the woman essentially ended. Decades passed and nothing strange ever happened to him again. He wanted to tie his peace with the events to his acceptance of spirituality, but he wasn't sure about it. He thought maybe it was more about his refusal to act on his suspicions. He felt something sensed that he wasn't a threat. And as he grew older, his memories of this terrible thing began to fade, blessedly, just like any other memories. He told me life was so long that the human mind could learn to endure and bury almost anything. There were Holocaust survivors out there, people who had lost their children in accidents, and when life became simply of a certain duration, these things just slowly faded. No matter how much they shook our beliefs, time inevitably did its work. And even though you can never be quite the same from what you'd experienced, those decades labored to make you whole again. He dedicated himself to his work and his children, and he simply never told anyone about what had happened. Until that night when he was 71, and he told me about it there on his back porch. Finally, I asked him if now he felt unburdened, or just maybe worried that telling the story held some power. He shook his head. He said, "No, I don't think so." And just maybe there was an explanation of the events that lay deep within his subconscious. The story was told to me in the year 1993. In 2012, my grandfather was 90 years old. We'd remained close since then, though I'd since graduated from college and gone on to have my own career as a doctor. I still visited him every year at Christmas. He still lived on his own, but now down in southern Maryland, in Solomons. This past winter I arrived there to stay for a couple of days, and we exchanged presents and had dinner, like always. He was very healthy and of sound mind. I took him out to a nice restaurant in town the night after Christmas, and I had to start driving back to Boston afterward. We got in the car at the restaurant, and I drove to his house. I remember that he had forgotten to lock his front door, which wasn't a big deal. He sometimes just didn't bother. Where he lived was very safe. We went into the house, and he told me to go down into the basement to take a box of toys that was there, back to my niece and nephew. So I went down the stairs into the unfinished basement. There was virtually nothing down there but a big table and a chair and boxes and boxes of mementos. When I turned on the light, I saw that something had been written on the gray cement wall on the east side of the house. It looked like it had been written in white chalk. I stared at those words. At first I didn't understand what they meant, because the first few of them were just nonsensical scribbling, letters a foot high that didn't make any sense. But below that there was an actual sentence. The words said, "Can you hear the bells?" A question. I heard my grandfather's footstep on the stairs above me, and I called out for him to stop. But something about the tone of my voice, so frightened, made him come further. And so he and I both stood and looked at what was written on the wall. I could see where the white chalk had come from. It had been taken from a plastic tub of it. That was one of the presents my grandfather had bought for my niece and nephew. Without saying a word, I guided him back to the staircase and I led him upwards. I was holding his arm tight so he wouldn't fall. We got up to the top of the steps and we walked to the front door of the house. We hadn't turned on the house lights yet, except for the one in the kitchen, and I could feel the darkness pressing in on us. I didn't look to my left or to my right for fear of what I might see. I ushered Grandpa to the car, and I opened the door for him and he got in. I slammed the door shut fast, and I trotted around to the driver's side and got in, and I tried to make it so that Grandpa wouldn't notice me quickly glance into the back seat in case something was there. Only when the doors were locked and the engine started did I feel safe. It was my intent to start driving us toward Boston, and we would never come back. Ever. I wouldn't let him. 3 turns through my grandpa's neighborhood was a street called Peach Run. Quiet, dark houses on either side. And my headlights picked out a figure up ahead, a human figure. It was a small woman moving away from us. When the headlights splashed across her back and flowed past her, and she was caught in that circle of light, she stopped. When she did, I did too, applying the brakes. I looked for a second at my grandpa in the dark. His eyes were wide, staring through the windshield. The woman turned towards us, and then she began to walk toward the car. The woman was old, so old. Her hair was long and dirty. She wore a plain dress that was almost more like a sack. When she walked, it was creakily, with a noticeable limp. My eyes went to her left hand, and there they were. There were the bells. Except they'd become so old and rusted over the decades that they seemed to be a permanent part of her flesh, which was blackened all around them. There must have been a deep infection at one point, untreated for years, and now her hand and the bells were one mutated object. It had been 63 years since my grandfather had heard them in the middle of the night as he sat in his room, frightened of this same woman who had never forgotten him. But at least she was mortal. She had aged, and eventually she would have to die. Whatever controlled her, whatever horrible thing she had done over a stretch of time so long I can barely conceive of it. Where had she traveled? Who had she killed? How many people had she killed without anyone ever locking her away somewhere for good? She staggered forward 3 more steps until we could really see every detail of her withered body. I took my foot off the brake and I hit the gas pedal then. And we swerved around her and we sped up, and I took a sudden right turn, which led us to the main road. When we got there, I drove us over the speed limit to the highway, and we were on it in 3 minutes. I kept saying, "It's okay, it's okay, it's okay," and Grandpa said nothing. He died just a month ago of viral pneumonia, 8 months after leaving his house that night. Neither of us ever returned to it. He moved in with me and my wife and my kids, who were only too happy to have him. We told them there had been terrible flooding in his house. I let a real estate agent handle everything about the sale. And how many nights have I spent wondering how long it will really take for that woman to die, so that there's no chance I'll be walking alone one night and feel her presence, and turn and see that she somehow found her way to Boston, wanting to demonstrate to me that she is not who I think she is. I'm not as mentally strong as my grandfather. I know my mind would break if she were to reach out to me in the dark, with a hand that had fused with bells that would never sound again. On November 5th of this year, I attended a dinner party with some fellow historians from Hofstra University, and I returned to my home just before 11 p.m. My small farmhouse, deep in the countryside, was covered in winter wrens, hundreds of them, watching me silently. That was how I knew my enemy was issuing a call to combat. At the age of 57, I was fortunate to have lived long enough to be ready. I looked fondly at the house I dwelled and studied in for a decade, and I drove away from it without going inside. The wrens saw me leave, and then they flew up into the night sky en masse, having played their part, unknowingly delivering a message they couldn't comprehend. I drove 84 miles to a small private estate in Noyak. I parked my car in front of a tasteful but long abandoned house set on 7 acres of woodland. I went around to the trunk of my car and I took out an electric lantern, and I walked around to the back of the property and then down the grassy slope to a tiny strip of beach, bracing myself against the cold wind. 2 rowboats were tied to a very short pier, tapping against each other as they bobbed up and down. I very carefully climbed into one of them, and I unhooked the rope that held it in place. It was about a 45-minute trip to my family's island across Little Peconic Bay. I had to stop rowing constantly to warm up my hands and my ears however I could. The silhouette of the aged lighthouse where I would do battle became visible against the stars halfway there. The lighthouse stood a few hundred yards off the beach where I dragged the rowboat onto the sand. A rough path led over some scrubland that became more and more dense as I walked it. When I reached the lighthouse, I pressed my hand against the cold wood of the front door and pressed inward. No human hand had performed this task for decades. Inside, the darkness and silence of a forgotten pharaoh's tomb. There was a smell like dead wet leaves and spoiled wine. I turned on my lantern and I climbed the winding stone stairs to the top of the lighthouse. The stairs ended in a small circular room. It looked out over the bay through a pair of windows that were clouded and caked in the remnants of age, though they had never actually been broken. No one came to this island, ever. I looked through the west window and I saw the tiny shape of that second rowboat drifting across the bay toward the island, navigated by my enemy. He would arrive soon. It should have been too cold to just stand there waiting for him, with the ancient stone conducting the chill into my body, but now that I was on the island, I was able to use the white magic to warm myself. He knocked on the door 20 minutes later. I opened it to see a very young man standing there in the darkness, a man of no more than 35. I held up the lantern. His hair was cut very short and he was clean shaven. He was very thin and he wore a denim jacket and very dark blue jeans. He announced his name, which was Frosch, and he asked to enter. His accent suggested he had been raised somewhere in northern Poland, or so I guessed. He followed me up the spiral staircase. He was wearing a backpack over one shoulder, and in the high room, He set it down on the musty floor. From it he took a bottle of Domaine de la Romanée. There was also caviar, the finest, he assured me, from Bandar-e Azali, 2 plates and 2 glasses, which my enemy informed me had been crafted in Madagascar for a prince. We sat on the floor across the room from one another, resting our backs against the walls behind us, and we ate and we drank. We talked about history, about the vineyard I owned and struggled with, about the Napoleonic Wars, about the meals we'd eaten in faraway places. It was quite cordial, as was the custom. After our meal there was still time before the arrival of the final message, and for Frosch that meant time for games. He clapped his hands once, and we stood. "You first," he invited me, and I nodded, and I told them to approach the west window. I had nothing prepared, so I improvised my trick. I said, "Look at the shoreline." I began by starting a fire in the sand down there. It rose from nothing, the shivering flames no more than 3 feet high, a campfire really, the only speck of light out there on the island. From the delicate waves that lapped the shore, there then rose 7 separate and unique sheets of water, 10 feet apart. First nothing more than spiral wisps, but cohering into more unusual shapes that were definable even in the dark. I let them hover on the waves for a moment, and then brought them slowly together to mold my creation. The sheets of water that had become arms, legs, a torso, and a head merged, and the man was made. He took his first and last steps on top of the water, and walked onto the beach toward the campfire I'd made. He glimmered in the moonlight, 6 feet tall. I made him kneel down before the fire. His face, that of a famous figure from military history, was immediately recognizable to my enemy, and he laughed. Though his eyes, cruel as any god had ever created, did not laugh. My waterman raised his arms, and slowly he leaned forward and tipped over onto the fire. When the water struck it, it went out. Nothing remained of him but a puddle on the beach, fanning out in many directions. My enemy scratched his chin and complimented me on my trick, and then offered to show me something more vivid. "Come to the window," he said. Standing beside him, I felt physically the evil he had brought with him to the lighthouse, to the island, to the earth. Outside, far away, almost a mile perhaps, a lonely sailboat moved across the bay at walking speed. Its mast had been lowered. I saw tiny orange lights on its rails. My night vision sharpened more and more, and I saw that the water around the boat was beginning to become choppy. I heard no sound when something broke the surface of the water beside the sailboat, erupting upwards. It was a tentacle, a lashing, slithering thing as thick as a stout oak, and it stretched many yards above the sailboat, suggesting it was attached to something below the water 10 times its size. The tentacle wrapped itself around the center of the boat and squeezed. The frame buckled, windows shattered. I saw but did not hear wood splinter and snap. Then the tentacle pulled the boat downward into the bay. It tilted crazily on its side, the tentacle still squeezing, crushing, shattering. The boat vanished beneath the waves in seconds, creating a suction pool behind it, the water bubbling and frothing, and very soon it was gone for good. The bay swallowed it whole, and the water became docile again. My enemy turned to me with an awful smile. We agreed to have one more glass of wine. He suggested a toast to life itself. Our glasses clinked. As the Domaine de la Romanée soothed my throat, we heard the wolf outside the door down below. Unseen, it began to howl low and steady. the sound winding up the staircase. My enemy froze for just a moment with his glass to his lips. Then he continued to drink. I asked my enemy what he would have me, as the host of the battle and thus obligated to make a sacrifice, give up to the hunger of the far spider. Your hands, he said. And again I nodded, so that we would be more comfortable in our final moments before what was to come. I created 2 simple wooden chairs for us by imagining them. Frosh dug into his backpack again. I expected him to draw from it a knife or a machete of some sort, but these were modern times. After all, and instead he handed me a pair of heavy, C-shaped metal boxes that fit easily into my palms. All I needed to do, he said, was trigger a small, taut 1-inch wire that stretched between a cutout section of each to make them operate. I asked him in a somewhat unsteady voice where he had come across such devices. He said, Kosovo. We took our chairs. I now sat roughly where my grandfather had in 1943, just 2 months after he had returned from Bastogne, and where his brother had sat only 6 years before that. That man, Carl by name, had been asked to give up his eyes as sacrifice, so perhaps my own wasn't so terrible. I told my enemy that the wolf had returned to its place beside the conqueror, and we were free to do as we must. And tensing against the trauma that was coming for me down a black and rotting tunnel, holding my hands far outward from my body as I had been instructed, I depressed the wires in both of the explosive devices. My hands were there 1 second, gone the next, as a thrumming crack echoed in that circular chamber, and the devices exploded. Shrieking pain snaked up both my arms and into the center of my chest, pulling and tearing at my heart from either side of my body. I sensed my enemy moving across from me as every bit of magic I held within flowed outwards and over him in a venomous wave. I opened my eyes to see him being lifted upwards out of the chair, his feet rising off the floor, his entire body rising vertically before me. 3 feet off the stone, then 5. He levitated and stared hatefully down at me, and I believe now that it was salt water pouring out of his eyes, salt water running down the front of his collared shirt. Then those eyes became grotesquely enlarged in their sockets as light pulsated behind them. A light of no color, a light possessing such energy coiled behind it that it could have cracked the earth if sent beyond the island. Instead, as Frosh hovered in the air, reaching out toward me with violently trembling arms that appeared to be trapped in the kind of haze within which one sees desert mirages, he spat his own magic at me with the force of nuclear fission. I felt myself being lifted up and then psychically pushed downwards toward the floor and then into it. I felt the splintering of rock as it absorbed my body. I was a powerless rag doll, and I went deeper into the stone floor, still looking up, seeing it all. 8, 10 feet. I was being embedded in the stone, and then that was when I blacked out. For me, the battle was over the second it began. The last thing I heard was a roar that emerged from my enemy as he spent the last parts of himself trying to destroy me with his chaotic, murderous mind. When I awoke, it was daylight. I was on the ground, lying face up, and a gray drizzle struck my face. It was dawn, but of which morning I didn't know. I was in the woods, resting on a natural bed of leaves, surrounded by dying trees and silence. My vision was blurry and my head was pounding. I looked down at my prone, withered body. It had once been the body of a relatively fit man of 57, but I was perhaps 30 pounds lighter than I last remembered myself. Blood had dried on the cuffs of my long-sleeved shirt and spattered all the way up to my shoulders. My hands were gone. For fear of what I might see if I looked too closely, I gazed at the sky until consciousness left me. I must have found my way to the nearest road, or maybe been found by a concerned stranger, because I remember the siren of an ambulance and the image of an Asian woman leaning over me in the back of one. After that, intravenous drips, a darkened hospital room, indistinct voices. I let myself drift in and out of sleep. Day became night, and night became day again, and the cycle repeated itself. When I could no longer feign unconsciousness or avoid the questions of the medical staff, I pleaded amnesia. I said I remembered nothing of anything that came after my dinner party. That seemed to placate them. I told them to refuse all visitors. They released me a day later. I didn't especially listen when they described the rehab process to me and the options I had for living life with my new handicap. I needed to simply be away from there as soon as possible. An orderly helped me put my clothes on, and I got into a cab outside the hospital. The cab driver, a man from Kenya who had once attended medical school, drove me all the way to the estate after I invited him to take my wallet and my bank card and make a single stop to withdraw as much money as it would take to deliver me to my destination and then complete one more task for me. We pulled onto the estate well after dark. It was 5 days after I had met my enemy. My driver followed me around to the back of the house. Once or twice he had to help me when I became dizzy. I hadn't eaten for several hours and I nearly passed out. When he asked me if I lived in this grand house, I told him no one had for 30 years. There were other rowboats, older and more decrepit, housed in the horse stable on the most forested side of the property. I couldn't help the driver in dragging one down to the shore. We climbed in, and he manned the oars. Despite the cold, he complained not at all. I was certainly paying him enough not to do so. Like me, he had to stop rowing every 5 minutes to warm his hands and his ears. When the rowboat bumped against the shore of the island, I bade him wait by the fire I felt myself just strong enough to create. He seemed confused at the sudden appearance of this fire nearby, but he walked off toward it after asking me if I was going to be able to make it to wherever I was going. Cradling a lantern in the crook of my right elbow, I staggered through the brush and scrub toward the lighthouse. I pushed the front door inward. As I did, I looked to my left, sensing a presence nearby. There, in the tattered undergrowth beside a withered tree, stood a gray wolf. The wolf, the island's only permanent resident, hundreds of years old, watched me enter the lighthouse. I made my way with great difficulty up the winding stone staircase, gently touching the insect-infested wooden handrails built by my great-great-great-grandfather, the most powerful warlock in all of North America. There was more illumination in here than before. The moon was full and bright. 5 steps from the top of the staircase, my foot kicked something, and there was an echoing clink. I saw by the light of the lantern the empty bottle of wine that I had shared with my enemy, and I stayed where I was for a long moment, knowing that magic was not the only way I could be killed. I listened for some tiny whisper of sound that might tell me that Frosch was somewhere above or behind me, in the dark, waiting to stab me to death, cut my throat. There was a thin, reedy whistling sound coming from high above me. It was the wind seeping through a window up there. It it had been shattered. I reached the top of the staircase, and I looked into the circular room. Leaves skittered across the floor, having been blown in. There was nothing here to remember, save for the thing which now defaced the center of the room, a crude new feature, which will not be seen by any man until the night my son comes to the lighthouse and casts the pale glow of his lantern across the lonely enclosure. The mummified body of my enemy was partially embedded in the floor, withered and shrunk by half, as if the work of 1,000 years had worn him to a fragment of what he once was, like the indistinct ghosts of Pompeii. He had been entombed in stone, his knees fused to the floor, as he crawled plaintively toward the window, one arm outstretched as if reaching it would have saved him somehow. There was very little detail of his face left, but what there was spoke of a pain few can imagine. The man's mouth was opened so wide in a silent scream that the very structure of his jaw had mutated. He was not the only man to have become a permanent part of the very structure of the lighthouse. Dozens of seemingly natural flaws, indentations, and bumps in the stone throughout were actually, upon closer look, remnants of the fallen. Toward the bottom of the staircase, 30 inches up the wall on the left side, was the shape of a man's foot, wholly embedded and seeming to push out from within. Further up the staircase, on the opposite wall, what appeared to be the crown of a man's head, enveloped entirely in the blind stone. A mutation in the ceiling above me was, in actuality, the right side of the screaming face of the malevolent African shaman who had challenged my father for supremacy. The rest of the shaman's body, torn asunder in the battle that took place in this room, was scattered in bits and pieces throughout the walls, as were the bodies of the other evil men who had tried and failed to make my family succumb. Eyes, hands, fingers, all were sealed just below the surface of the stone inside this lighthouse, where the world was defended from destruction. It was a grotesque museum of our hollow victories. My son would be the next to fight. An invitation would come in the form of a gathering of silent winter wrens. He would have to leave his family in the small hours, perhaps never to see them again. He would row to the island to face his enemy. It would happen just once in his lifetime. I myself need never use the magic again, and never will I need to return to the lighthouse and cast eyes through the darkness upon the hideous statue of an evil man who will not be the last to make that little room into a place where unthinkable combat is waged beside a sleepy bay. On the 27th moon of the year of the shining cloud, I awoke in our encampment with a terrible feeling. For 5 days we'd been without motion in any direction, waiting for the nights to give us the order to move east, but it hadn't come. So our days had been spent sharpening our pikes, shaving our arrow points, and at night there were songs and stories as we hoped and prayed a miracle would come for us. But that morning I sensed a stirring among the men, and one by one they woke up, and we could see fire on the horizon. And then here they came, 1,000 men, marching and on horseback, and when I saw them coming over the hill I put my head in my hands and told myself that I was not certainly dead. I couldn't know that this was the end. But every man in camp despaired, especially when we saw that more and more armies joined the first, until in the end there were thousands of men spread out around us. and we had to move from Red Rael because there was no room in its fields for us all. Preparations were begun for the march, orders were shouted, and we were aligned in columns. All fires were quashed, the wagons were loaded with supplies, the tent struck down. It took hours. Herrick, my only friend, who I now clung to for his bravery so I wouldn't go mad, told me he guessed our journey overland would be only of a single day. He said he could tell this by the amount of supplies we were leaving behind for the wolves. One day, that meant we were all headed for the shore. We started to move at midday, more than 4,000 soldiers moving through the mud. Word came through the ranks that almost a dozen men hadn't moved from camp. They'd simply stayed and asked to be executed. Stieg, a pikeman, told me he'd seen it happen. The nights were excessively harsh. When a man fell out of line or a wagon was slowed, they barked and shouted orders, and we followed them, keeping our heads down. Toward the beginning of dusk, I heard a man sobbing off to my left, and I turned and I saw a young spearman who had broken down, but his step did not slow. At night, when we expected to rest, we did not rest. Torches were lit, and we entered the inchlet forest. We could sometimes see figures, human figures, watching us at a safe distance. These were the woods people, but they may as well have been the angels of death. Later I saw a man and a woman standing close enough that I could make out their faces by the firelight. They had faces like stone idols, without any emotion or sympathy. There was no food for us. We walked all night through the cold. What did the nights care, after all, if we were starved? I heard men fall, but I didn't look back. Just as light came, the order came down for us to slow our movement. We had broken through the woods an hour before, and a quarter hour after that, the night suddenly galloped ahead, and we saw the sea. 8 great warships waited for us. We ceased movement and then began the laborious process of loading the armies onto them. It was more waiting, but now at least we were allowed to rest, and soup came down the lines and bread, just enough to keep us conscious. The knights sent guards through with assignments, and the armies began to separate from each other. More than anything, I didn't want to be separated from Herrick. I stayed close to him. He cursed the disorganization of the knights under his breath. Something was wrong with him. He clutched his stomach as he spoke. It took more than 2 hours of interminable shuffling and shifting to get us onto the ships. We were moving inch by inch across the gangplank, sometimes stopping. Something thudded beside me. I looked down, and a man had collapsed almost at my feet. It was Herrick. I reached down, and so did the man beside me. Herrick's face was locked in a scream, but no sound emerged. He lay on his side, not moving. A guard came through and hovered over him, and then he pushed me out of the way as I shook Herrick desperately. The guard said, "He's died." He said it very softly. "He's died." It hadn't been an ordinary death. It had been fear that killed him. His face told us so. It was Stieg who kept me from collapsing myself, pushing me on. Inside the galley, I couldn't sleep on the wooden supports. More meaningless hours went by as we waited for the boat to leave the shore, not knowing why we weren't on our way. The men took their places where they could, and we were left alone. The knights and guards collected up on the deck to begin their planning. There were no more warships to come. Every available man had already been called. That night I passed in and out of consciousness, sometimes raising my head when I heard a disturbance strike the water. which I would learn at dawn had been the sound of men throwing themselves from the brig. I saw in the middle of the night a long swordman, still in full armor, staring silently through one of the portholes, and I made my way over to him. I was desperate for human contact, even if it was completely wordless. Our ship was on the far left of the formation of the fleet, and all I could see at first out there was the open ocean. But within minutes, I saw a shape out there on the water, a vessel sailing in the opposite direction, toward Red Rayo. It was a great carrack. The long swordman saw it in real detail before I could, and he invoked the gods in a bloodless whisper. For there was no one on that ship. It drifted without aim across the water, pushed off from somewhere miles and miles away, and our own boat was now turning away from it toward the north in an effort to avoid striking it. It passed close enough so that we could hear the creaking of its masts. This invaluable vessel had no crew, no captain, no troops. They'd been left on Alberiag to die, and none had returned. This was the ship we'd been waiting for in the encampment back in Orain. I could feel men behind us peering out into the dark, watching the boat move past, on its way to its natural end. Shortly after the sun rose, I saw that its color was not as it should have been. There was a faint yellow tinge in the sky, and upon seeing this, one of the Kalak soldiers began to wail and cry out for the gods to sink our ship in mercy. The rest of us, almost to a man, lapsed into a hypnotized silence as we watched the yellow color become more and more intense until we were sailing into a surreal blanket of warm gold, a thick sort of fog of color that drenched every ship. Sir Roderick then appeared in the hold, and the first thing he said to us was, "We are landing on Alberiag." He went on to say that we could, if we wished, write to our loved ones, and our messages would be held on board for the ship's return trip to Red Rael. 2 guards appeared and began to pass out parchment and ink. Sir Roderick began to instruct us then, explaining in the driest terms the plan we were to follow upon disembarking, procedures which we had to follow to absolute precision to save seconds. It would be only a march of 2 miles to our attack point. The ship would touch the shore of Alberiag in less than 6 hours. He spoke further of divisional assignments. For 4 of those 6 hours, the elderly cleric, Christed, led us in a mass that he pushed ever onward. His voice became hoarse. He had to stop for water several times as he spoke every word he could from the Book of the Star. Finally, he could speak no more. The sky above the sea was drenched in a thick amber glow, as if the sun had caught fire and was dying. Sometimes the sky would seem to flicker, as if lightning were trying to press through from another realm. Night and day had no meaning here, as since the summer of the previous year that sky had remained a constant over Alberiag through every hour. 60 minutes out from shore, we began to hear a sound we'd never known existed. There had been no tales of it. One had to listen close in the beginning to hear it over the waves. It was the sound of 1,000, perhaps 10,000 creatures, not humans, more like animals, baying animals who had congregated and were now emitting a common cry of excitement and anger. It rose slowly all around us, and by the time land came into view to the north, every man was hearing it, and every man, including Sir Roderick, had gone quiet. We began to see through the amber cloak the features of that undefended shore, which seemed so much like our own back home. Sir Roderick commanded us to begin to maneuver into position for a swift disembarkation, which meant pressing against each other near the keel. 4 lancers began to frantically ready the gangplank for lowering. We wedged in so tight against each other that it was difficult to breathe. We had to hope that the steersman would not cause such an abrupt landing that the contact would crush the men in the first ranks. My breath came shorter and shorter as we heard the bottom of the stem scrape the shoals, and then we had landed. A messenger lad shouted out, and the gangway began to lower, allowing that diseased light to flood in. No one hesitated to exit the hold which had held us captive, even though the sound of that cloud of dissenting, angry voices became much louder when the cold air struck us. We lined up on the shore, having very little room to maneuver. We were shoved this way and that by the momentum of whichever soldier moved to one's left and right. The horses, the dogs, the weapons, they were all offloaded from one of the ships with great speed. It was obvious that things were moving much more swiftly than had been planned, because the knights must have sensed the new panic among us that the mysterious outcry of unknown origin was causing. When all men were off the ships, the lines that formed in order to move quickly toward the weapons caches came together fast. The knights had to shout louder and louder to get their words through to us, and many of the men seemed to have stopped responding. Their movements had become as slurred as their speech when drunk. I was handed a halberd, and immediately was urged to start to march. As for sticking to the formations described to us on the ship, this plan seemed to have been almost immediately abandoned. We were to simply go forward as quickly as we could. Almost 4,000 soldiers began to march. I knew no one anymore. The faces were all unfamiliar. We reached grass. A wide field was stretching away from us, but the grass was dead and withered. The tumult of voices was getting louder and louder, coming from just up ahead. Now a man on my left dropped his blade, and when he reached down for it, he stayed on his knees. And then he curled on the cold ground as if wishing to sleep, like a little boy, and no one stopped for him. Another man dropped to the ground. He had lost his footing, and he made a half attempt to rise, but from the despair on his face, I knew that he would not get up again. And his eyes closed, and he collapsed, right there. The knights were urging us over the din to stop for nothing when we engaged. The healers had all been issued weapons as well, so there would be no medicine or treatment for the fallen. On a certain call, they abandoned their horses, leaping from them, and they raised their blades. And at the top of the hill, their shouts became full-throated, red-faced cries, the sound of them utterly lost beneath the enemies. Now our visibility had been cut to just a few hundred yards with the intensity of the amber fog. Over the hill, just up ahead, was the fissure. A crack more than a mile wide, with a mouth 20 feet high. Inside it, utter darkness. Now torches were rapidly lit all around, including mine, as a boy of no more than 14 anointed my free hand with fire. I was out in front. I would be among the first 100 men in, even in front of the mercenary ranks. The cry was put forth to run, and the knights, the bravest among us, did not hesitate from their duty to lead the charge. They began to rush toward the fissure. I ran. The footing beneath me was firm. I could see, reflected off the roof of the fissure, a flicker of light, then another, and another, which meant the enemy was emerging with their own burning torches. We entered that terrible pit as one rampaging, undisciplined mass. I cannot say where the divide truly was between earth and hell, But as soon as my voice abandoned me and my eardrums began to shake with the force of the enemy's echoing collective scream, a face appeared in the darkness. The face of a being that was not meant for even a single step outside the fissure. It had once been a man, or something's imagining of one, but there was no clothing on its body, and its bones were only half protected by human flesh. A skeletal beast it was, 2 feet taller than I, having no eyes and an enormous skull that was hideously bovine. It had not hands but claws, a filthy sword gripped in one, a torch gripped in the other. Its jaws were opening and closing many times in a single second, like a machine come to life. And before I could even raise my own weapon to strike it, Satan's thousands upon thousands of like-bodied atrocities became visible far beyond this one, in the rank and fetid shadows, as their fires broke the darkness, and their counter-invasion began.